Hi hackers, how's it going? We will get started in just a couple of minutes, let people roll in. In the meantime, if you all have not yet done so, go ahead and check in. Drop the link in chat. Hello! Yes, warm welcomes. I'm glad to see you all here. I'm trying to stay hydrated. How's everyone doing? Cool. Have y'all had a good Global Hack Week so far? Learned anything cool? I'm doing well, thanks for asking. I'm excited to talk about bias in AI and ML. Yay! It's good to see you all. What is it your first time for? Is it your first Global Hack Week? Exciting. Welcome to the community. Have y'all been reading anything fun recently? Thanks for hopping in. It's good to see you. Yeah, it's 12:30 a.m. over there. You should definitely get some sleep. All right. So basically, we're gonna go through. I have some slides for us today, and this will be very casual. Like, if y'all have anything you want to add, definitely drop it in chat. I'll be monitoring it. But yeah, hopefully we can open up some conversation on bias in AI and ML. Basically, we'll talk about how we can make ethical decisions when we're building AI ML systems, so that when we're creating technologies, we're putting human values and ethics first. Yeah, and we'll talk about the types of biases in AI and ML. So let's get started. For those of y'all who have not met me yet, I'm Alina. I'm a coach here at Major League Hacking. I do a lot of different things. I study computer engineering, and I organize hackathons and do fun stuff. But Today I'll be talking about bias in AI and ML, and I'm really excited for this because um, in the process of yes, I agree. Working with AI is very closely connected with ethics, and that's why I'm so really excited to talk about this because I do think it goes very hand in hand. Um, so yeah, let's get started. So basically, we're going to introduce what AI and ML is, and since y'all have some of y'all have been to other sessions. They've talked about what AI ML is, so we'll just go over this very briefly. We'll talk about the types of biases, the things that cause bias, how bias impacts our systems, and then how to mitigate it. And we will have um, a discussion based sort of session of case studies. That's the idea I have for it now. Maybe we'll have some people who want to hop on stream and talk about different case studies, or maybe you'll have some ideas of case studies that we could look into. Um, and then we'll have a general conclusion and just, revisit some of the main topics that we talk about throughout these slides. Anyone have any introductory thoughts before we get started? Cool. Looks like we're all good. I will be sharing these slides and a GitHub repo shortly after we get off of stream. And I'll drop it in the Global Hack Week, just general chat on Discord, so you can go on to GitHub and sort of follow along later if you'd like, or revisit some of this information. Cool. All right. So what is AI ML? Well, AI stands for artificial intelligence, for those of y'all who may not know, although it's a pretty popular topic these days, so it's very common to know those terminologies. Basically, AI focuses on creating algorithms and systems that can perform different tasks. And it's meant to resemble a lot of what human intelligence is like. So, there some of the applications of AI are image recognition. Those are things that human intelligence can do. And we're basically teaching a system to be able to do something like that, or natural language processing. It's something that our brains naturally do when we know a language. We know how to process things that people are saying to us. And in AI, we're basically trying to teach another system to be able to do that, right? So AI is a field in computer science where we specifically focus on creating algorithms and systems that would normally require human intelligence. There's a lot of pattern recognition, decision making, and problem solving. And these are all things that humans do. We are teaching a system to be able to do something like this, right? And then we have machine learning, which is basically a subset of AI, which specifically focuses on developing the algorithms that we talk about, right? Machine learning is very data heavy, so we use a lot of data to make predictions or to improve how fast we can make decisions. And we basically use algorithms to build out machine learning algorithms and develop them so that we can then integrate them into artificial intelligence, right? So overall, why do y'all think it would be critical to understand bias in these sorts of in AI and machine learning? Does anyone have anything they'd like to add? Hello. Why do you think it's necessary to understand why bias exists or what it could be like in AI models? All good. We'll hold. There are a few people who are trying to type out an answer. Yeah, yeah. Someone in the chat said if AI is used for business decisions, um, bias can have huge effects. Absolutely. Mhm. A model with high bias can't generalize very, very test sets. That is true. A model with really high bias also um, could generalize incorrectly, right? And that could be an issue. Yeah, that's good. Cool. Hello. Yeah. So it's really important to understand. Let me drop the check-in link just in just a second. There you go. Yeah, I like that. I like that a lot. VJ 525. In other words, a biased model is like a student who knows a couple of answers perfectly, but will stumble if any other question comes in the exam. Yeah, that's definitely true. Mm-hmm. Having biases can be detrimental in the health industry. Nice. Cool. It can skew medical diagnosis. Yes. Um, you could have you could have biases that could diagnose people incorrectly or um, have a hard time diagnosing a certain subset of people, perhaps. Yeah. And because we use AI and ML in a lot of really important industries, and since we're starting to integrate AI and ML into those industries, it's also really important that we are holding best practices and trying to limit the types of bias and um, any sort of factors that might be unfair into those spaces. Okay, 404 not found says, say there's a person training an AI to give out loans for startups. Say the person who was training it was subconsciously slightly biased against the female gender as startup CEOs. That bias will carry on to the AI, and that AI is to be deployed into a complete banking environment will lead to big reduction of loans. Oh, mhm. Will lead to big reduction of loans being granted to startups with female leads, which could lead to many problems for obvious reasons. Definitely. Yeah. Another issue with data bias is systemic inequalities stemming from AI being deployed. Yep. Yeah, I love that y'all are touching on all these points because we're definitely going to in the slides like go through some of these things. I love that y'all have like lots of thoughts and ideas coming into this. That's awesome. One of the reasons why integration of AI is more difficult in medical as compared to other industries. Um, yes, absolutely. You're awesome. Thank you. Yeah, so y'all have touched on a lot of really good points. So yes, it's really critical to understand bias in AI and machine learning because our algorithms and models are being used in a lot of important areas of our lives, right? Such as some of the ones we touched on, healthcare, finance, in employment, in criminal justice, right? And if we're creating algorithms that are biased, they can continue on and almost like amplify like already existing inequalities, which obviously can lead to a lot of like serious consequences, right? And bias can even be, Jackson 6255 says bias can even be introduced by poor choices in training. Yes, test splits and choices of training data, absolutely. And we're going to talk about that in just a moment. Um, yeah, so y'all gave some really good examples. Like if we were to use an AI model in criminal justice, it could lead to a biased AI model. It could lead to perhaps unequal treatments of maybe we have defendants that we're looking into based on like things like their race or their genders or maybe their socioeconomic statuses, right? or in healthcare, it could result in maybe unfair access to treatment or lower quality of care, or wrongful diagnosis. Um, yeah, and in employment, if we're using AI to hire people, we could also have biases that perhaps hire people unfairly, or predict pay gaps for disadvantaged populations based on their race, or their ethnicity, or their gender, or maybe their age. Um, so yeah, we really do need to understand um, why ethical guidelines are necessary, so that we can prevent possible consequences, right, in the future, and so that we can also be careful in the types of algorithms and the systems that we put out, so that they're fair for the populations that they will engage with. Mhm. Cool. So yeah, awesome. So, what are some types of biases, right? There are a lot of different types of biases, but we'll go over um, algorithmic bias, data bias, and human bias. Basically, and these can kind of almost subset from one another. So, algorithmic bias generally refers to errors that are caused by um, inaccuracies that happen in our AI models. Um, because of biases that we use to train our algorithms, or design the algorithms, right? And algor- and when we're designing algorithms, um, we need to be able to evaluate the types of features that we're putting into our algorithms, and how those types of features can introduce bias. Does anyone have any questions so far, or want to talk about algorithmic bias? Maybe an example or something that you want to add there. I'll let y'all type for a moment, but I'll go on and continue talking about data bias. So data bias is basically when we're sort of introducing bias based on the data that we provide to our models, and this can be when we have machine learning models, and the big question is, where are we getting our data from, right? Who are we using? What's the population of people that we're using to get our data from? And when we're the initial collection of data can be really, really important for everything that comes after it, because you have the data that you gather, and then everything sort of builds off of it, right? So your machine learning models um, build and learn from the data, from that initial data that you provided, and then it can, in machine learning, you can have models that learn, that do continuous learning. But if your initial data is bad, or if it's biased, that's going to continue and become a serious issue down the line, right? So we need to be very cautious of the types of data that we're sampling, the populations that we're sampling, and how we're measuring things within our data, how we're selecting the populations for our data. There's BJ525 has an example that I will show to everyone. For algorithmic bias. So an example of this is credit card fraud. Most databases have one fraudulent example for 99 normal transactions. Wow. So a model with 99% accuracy, return normal, will lead to a lot of lost cash. That is very interesting. Wow. And yeah, that can definitely add up over time, right? Absolutely. Thank you. Thanks for sharing. Yeah, and then there's an example of data bias. So a natural language processing model for sentiment analysis tends to be more positive if the data on which it is trained has a large number of positive text data and vice versa. Wow, that's cool, right? Because in natural language processing, um, the type of data that we provide is definitely really important because it can introduce a lot of cultural context that comes in from how people speak. And if you're trying to perhaps like uh, do natural language processing on various different cultures or races, um, you could see some variation in the way people talk, and sort of knowing where that culture comes from is really important to actually build a good model. That's neat. Thank you. And then human bias, this exists everywhere, right? Even outside of the context of AI. Um, and but it is important to talk about within the scope of AI because um, anything that we're creating, right, comes from an initial group of people who are building these systems. So it's really important to have a diverse group of people and a diverse set of perspectives. Because we, as human decision makers, or data scientists, or software engineers, uh, or anyone really involved in the building of a system or a product, and this can include managers or businesses, anyone in the business process, basically, can introduce bias into AI systems, even if they're not directly handling, building the algorithms or building the system itself, because they can have their own interpretation of problems or their own interpretation of how things should be. Um, yeah, so that sort of leads me into like what causes different types of bias. Yeah, human bias. I like that a lot. Human bias is like when mom chooses a younger sibling over you, and there may or may not be any good reason for it. But if it happens, that is a type of bias, and it can have major implications. In the case of, in the case of this, you could have, maybe one sibling feels uh, maybe one sibling feels left out, or you know unloved, and that's just sad. But it can have very serious implications. Absolutely. Yeah. VJ525 also says, on a more serious note, getting mathematical data from the population with lower technological literacy can be harder. That is true. So, that sort of brings me to a question, like, how do you reach those people then, right? Because it is really important that we are diverse in where we're getting our data from. And it's naturally going to be that, maybe depending on where you're located, or what kind of resources you have access to, maybe you're able to sample a certain population of people better than you are another, but that shouldn't be the reason as to why you leave out a set of a population. We have some other comments. A human training model would make it right according to what he believes is right, but he may be undermining other cultures and human beliefs. Yes. Yeah, absolutely. So, going back to, let's just go back to the last slide. It seems like we're, talking about some of these things. So yeah, human bias it definitely comes in from, each individual's cultural experiences. So we, unknowingly, oftentimes as individuals, can incorporate bias and do incorporate bias into the way we think and make decisions. And those types of biases, when we're creating algorithms for our machine learning models or for our systems, our own biases will basically be integrated into the systems that we create. And that's why it's really important to have a diverse group of individuals working on these systems, right? Because if you have, you know, say you have a subset of a population that all lives, I'm located in the Baltimore region. Say that say that you have, a group of people who have maybe lived in one subsection of the world for a majority of their life, and knows about the day-to-day ins and outs of that subsection of people. They're not going to be fit. That team of people is not going to be fit to design things that affects a diverse group of people all around the world. Or if they were to create a system, there would definitely be biases that they, maybe not even intentionally, but unintentionally, would introduce into their system. So it's really important for them to perhaps have other people who have their own understanding of the problem of the world, and interpretation of how they're creating these systems. And yeah, I agree that human bias is inevitable. I like that a lot. Yeah, VJ525 says, in my opinion, human bias is inevitable, data bias is treatable, and algorithmic bias is researchable. So that's very interesting. Definitely, I do agree that human bias is something that is always going to be there to some degree. I think the main thing to think about here is how can we limit the amount of human bias that we can introduce, or hopefully not introduce. Yeah, thank you. Cool. So what are some causes of bias, right? We talked a little bit about this. And, oh, sorry. Yeah, we talked a little bit about this. It's about how the quality of our data, right? Where are we getting our data from? Is it coming from a diverse group of people? Is it flawed? Is it flawed, historically? Is it old data that no longer, represents the current state of the world? Is it represented incorrectly? Is it, collected because it was convenient to, get data from a very close subset of people? Is it, measured correctly? Are we using the right sorts of tools? Especially when we think about like image processing, are we using the right types of sensors and tools that are needed to, enable a fair collection of data from a diverse range of people? Nice. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you all for joining from it being so late at night. um, Data quality. Yeah, so data quality. We need to make sure that the quality of the data, where we get it from, is something that is representable for the data that we aim to collect. And we do need to have a large set of data, especially with machine learning models, right? Your model can only be as good as the amount of data that it's been trained on. And this can take time, but it also is very necessary to have a very wide set of data that you can test on, and a diverse set of data. And then because in machine learning, we're, building algorithms, these algorithms, how they're designed is really important, because if we're building algorithms that, are perhaps, based in bias, or have a very, like, I guess, unequal understanding of the data, or maybe it, doesn't properly represent the data. Maybe you are building an algorithm, or maybe you're building an algorithm that doesn't actually, um, fit what you're trying to solve or do. So how well does your algorithm actually align to what you're, you know, trying to build? And VJ525 says there's a theory called the universal approximation theorem that states that there is a minimum size of data used for training for a deep network to give results over a threshold. Yes, and that goes back to having a wide range of data, enough data so that you can actually make any sort of useful predictions or bring any sort of value. With your whether it be AI models or AI or machine learning models. Yeah. And something that's interesting about like model building and training is that you really do need to when it comes to data, like be able to like train the data um, with a lot of testing and tuning the model, right? If you have an algorithm or you're building an AI model, it needs to be tuned to like what you're actually building it for. Make sure you're validating the results you get back to what you actually set out to do. Um, and so it's very much like this feedback loop of is this model successful and deployable, or do we need to go back and evaluate how we're collecting this data, why we're even collecting the data, right? Like the big why. Um, so, we need a lot of data, but we also need it to actually fit what we're trying to, it needs to actually fit our models. Mhm. Cool. Um, let's see. An IBM research in healthcare failed to produce good results. I guess the answer because they were focused on more data quality. Um, sorry. Yeah, and definitely medical research. Um, I think it's always sort of a slippery slope. I think even when humans are involved, medical research is a slippery slope because you want to make sure that you're classifying things properly. And even with all of this information that we have on um, medicine, especially with fields that are under researched, it becomes really important if we are to introduce AI and machine learning into those fields that we are going back and sort of, going back to this algorithmic design aspect, that we're actually checking if our models are successful and if we're actually getting the results that we are expecting. And this sort of goes back to our data scientists that are out there and who are doing a big portion of collecting this data, and they're trying to understand what the desired outputs should be, so that they can understand how to actually tell a model what it needs to compute or what it needs to come up with. um, and so there's definitely a lot of uncertainty when it comes to uh, why why biases can happen, um, and sort of having, I'd say like there's a lot of uncertainty in spaces when we're using AI and ML because we're sort of defaulting away from uh, the human biases, and I think there's a lot of fear with that. But the thing is, if we are going to have good models and if we do it well, um, a lot of the times these systems can provide a lot of success and be really useful in various industries. It just has to be done in a way that is actually useful. Um, yeah. So I think we've touched up on a little bit of this, but what are some impacts of bias, right? There are a lot of, we're going to talk about social and ethical implications, legal and regulatory consequences, and impacts in industries. Uh, Sorry, it seems like some of these words are overlapping, but um, I will talk about them. So, uh, yeah, there are a lot of implications for bias in AI and ML that reach really far. We talked about a lot of industries that they would affect, and in terms of social and ethical implications, we talked about discrimination, right? Um, we want to. Um, there's obviously, if we have models that are unequal, we can introduce unequal treatment of perhaps certain groups, and this could lead to unequal access that people might have to opportunities or services that they would need to use that otherwise wouldn't um, really. Sorry, I'm reading the chat. Bias can range from getting a grade penalty at uni at some undeserved arrest to some undeserved arrest. Yes. Um, yeah, definitely. Based on it's 1 a.m. Thank you so much, Agarwals. Although if you have an end of semester exam at 8 a.m., I encourage you to rest up for that. I do appreciate you being here, though. Yeah, absolutely. So, with discrimination, we need to be really careful of reinforcing like stereotypes that might already exist. So if there is bias that's already in an algorithm, we can let's hope your exam is an AI exam. But we can reinforce stereotypes that might already exist within our algorithm. So say that we take data that has been introduced to our machine learning models that incorporates bias. Maybe it's a image recognition um, model, or maybe we're processing images in this model, and if we used like the wrong types of sensors to actually gather our data, um, we could have trained our model to incorrectly identify individuals with different tones of complexion. And that could be, and then our model could go on with our set data. Maybe we feed it a lot of data, but if our initial sensors that we use weren't good enough to make the predictions that we wanted to make or to build the models we wanted to build, then we could sort of perpetuate that cycle within our model to, you know, reinforce stereotypes or prejudices that already exist. Um, so, when it comes to discrimination, we could be, unknowingly or just carelessly introducing discrimination into places, going all the way back from how we initially collected data, built our model, and then deployed those models. So we want to stay away from reinforcing stereotypes and prejudices and try to pull those out as much as we can throughout each process of the way. Because another thing that is an implication is that it's hard to actually trace back accountability for things like this, right? Like when you have an AI algorithm that's designed by a large group of people or government even, it can make it really difficult to say, this particular individual or this group of people are the ones who actually are responsible for this. Um, because the bias can be introduced at various levels, right? So you could have the human bias that happens when you're collecting the data. But you can also have biases in the algorithm that was, developed by another set of people. And then you could have those models that are being trained over time. And it's like who actually gets, who is held accountable for a model that has gone through and learned over time. Thank you for joining. I will see you later. It's good to see you. Yeah, but sorry, I lost my train of thought. We were talking about accountability. Yes, it can make it really hard to trace back accountability to people. And not to mention that if we are being, discriminatory, or if there are people who have, negative intentions towards, building out systems, then we could sort of perpetuate their cause very quickly through some of our models, and that could have some serious consequences. So if we talk about legal and regulatory consequences, who gets the liability for the discrimination, which we touched on just a little bit. Yeah, someone mentioned in chat, we can't really call a model like itself. It's not a thing. It's not a thing that we can, take into court and sort of hold up against in the court of law. So, it sort of has to be traced back to groups of people, but that can be really challenging to do. Yeah, so, and especially so with legal and regulatory consequences, we have companies that collect data, right, on humans, and on how we do things, and the decisions that we make day to day. And when it comes to data privacy with AI, we can have algorithms that are collecting and storing our data. A lot of personal data, maybe on how you use a certain site, the types of things you shop for, or where you go, and what your language is like, who you follow on social media, what kinds of content you're interested in, and those kinds of things can also be used to then target groups of people, maybe through the ads that you're showing, or or the type of products that you are more likely to buy. And that sort of goes into, is that violating your personal data, or your privacy, your right to privacy? And there are, court will be wild if we have AI in court. I agree with that. To those of you mentioning that in chat. Yeah. So there's a lot of considerations when it comes to, privacy with data, because you could sort of exploit groups of people once you've collected data, and you're using these models to show them a certain type of, certain types of content, or sort of urging them to use different services and products. And it's really important to sort of remember in the back of our heads when we're building systems like this, that we do need to take into account people's privacy and not exploit that, even though we might have access to their data. And then talking about intellectual property, right? So I'm sure a lot of you have heard of ChatGPT. It's been a big sort of discussion recently. So, when it comes to using AI, or if you've heard of like generative art, when it comes to using AI for those purposes, who actually holds the intellectual property, right? If AI is used to create new algorithms, or new technologies, who actually owns it? Does the company who initially built the AI own it? Does the AI own it? there's a lot of gray area there, about where do we draw the lines between, um, this company built the original AI, which then went on to build other things. Who owns the things that are being built? And then who can we trace back? Again, going back to legal consequences, who can we trace back to having created, if there is an issue, who can we bring, into the court of law and sort of hold accountable, right? Um, and so it can be sort of a gray area there. Um, oh, that's cool. We have a user here, that has an AI and ChatGPT group, um, from people in the industry. So if you want to connect, and be a part of that, go for it. Yes, someone, VJ525 mentions in chat that ethical AI is the new norm, but in their opinion, it should have been the new norm. It should have never been the new norm, but the initial norm of AI research. And definitely agree with you on that, right? Is really from the start, and that's why when we build forward, we really do need to keep in mind, how the things that we build affect people, right? Um, I have a background in, computer engineering, so we follow as engineers. Maybe some of y'all have heard of the IEEE Code of Ethics, and it's basically a binding code of ethics that, has principles of how engineers, should develop, new technologies in the world. Basically, do no harm. And so, really, this sort of, I wish that it would, you know, be a thing that we could incorporate into all areas of, business, even because, yeah, because everyone in the process of building a new system or creating something new, a new technology, should be bound by some sort of ethics. And we do have legal consequences and different groups, in business that are held accountable for different things. But in the science world, we do need to have, sets of standards for building new technologies that everyone is bound to. Yeah. So we do have a lot of, so going to regulations, we do have a lot of, governments that are using AI, um, and that are integrating AI into society. And so we need to basically have a framework, for a responsible way to use the AI, and also regulations based on this AI, which would basically regulate the development or the distribution and or the distribution of, these various technologies. And I know that somewhere in, Europe, uh, don't quote me on this, but somewhere in Europe there is, a regulation on, how they use like artificial intelligence, and they're trying to build like a standard for it. But I definitely think that that's something, w- needs to be sort of a standard across the globe as we develop these technologies, because we're all really very connected by technology, and things that happen in one country often affect people in others. Um, so governments around the world are working on like taking steps to regulate how we develop and distribute AI and machine learning, by like introducing like data protection laws, to combat like data privacy, or you know laws that sort of govern, the use of AI, like where is it okay to use AI, and how we can be transparent about it. Um, so there's actually a, act that was, proposed in the U.S. It's called the AI Governance Act. It's interesting if you want to go look into it, but it basically is looking to establish sort of a framework so that we can have responsible use of AI and distribution of it as well. Um, yeah, and then going back to intellectual property, when it comes to licensing, like different types of AI, we need to make sure that the people who are sort of establishing the certification for this AI, the developers are actually doing so in an ethical manner, and those are things that just need to be regulated better. And those are interesting areas to sort of look into when you think of these technologies being created. How can we actually have governments sort of cooperate together internationally almost to sort of address like the implications of distributing these technologies globally, and how we can come up with standards that we can follow along around the world. Cool. And we did talk about like different industries earlier that are impacted by AI. Healthcare is a really big one. It's one I'm really interested in because when you think about like medical diagnosis or treatment recommendations, or like overall like looking at a population and managing health there, uh, if we have bias in AI and ML models, we could do some harm there, really, because you could have people being treated unequally based on like people. We could be treating people incorrectly based on their race or gender if we just don't have enough data about it. Say that we don't have enough data about a particular type of um, diagnosis within a certain race of people, and if we use data that we have that's very generalized and not specific to a certain group of people, we could be harming a group of people by using very generalized data that may not fit their own sort of specific condition. We talked about the criminal justice system a little bit. If we're using like AI to like police people, or to maybe in the future like grant sentences, we need to really make sure that we're giving those models a good amount of information to actually be able to make any sort of decision. And I think sort of going back to human bias, we can have human bias when making decisions like that, but I do think it would be really useful to have sort of AI and humans work very closely hand in hand, almost doing like a check, fact checking each other, in especially in places like that. Yeah. And also like impacts an industry of like employment. So there are a lot of groups who are like HR departments that are using AI to screen applicants for jobs, or evaluate performance within a job, or sort of plan long term the types of individuals that they'll bring onto a team. And when we think about things like that, if we are, building models that say hire, and a lot of the times what's interesting about this type of bias is that it's not something that we're intending to do, but it happens as a consequence of the data that we feed it. So say that we, feed our model data of hiring, 60% male to 40% female. If the model and the algorithm, the way it's written, interprets that in a way that's different than what the intention was, it could sort of build a gender gap within the people that it tries to employ. And you could apply that to age or race. And so those are some sort of important things to look at when we talk about sort of closing these gaps within our industries, whether it's age or gender or just diversity in general, and when we talk about having an inclusive and diverse workforces. Um, yeah, cool. Thank you all for some really thoughtful uh, ideas and content in the comments. I'm really enjoying this. Um, so now we'll talk about mitigating bias, right? So how do we actually limit the amount of bias that we're incorporating into our systems? And we have touched on a lot of this, and I've liked the way that we've sort of done this. It's been very much a discussion, and so we've sort of hopped around from idea to idea. So yeah, so mitigating bias, right? We've talked about data collection. We need to make sure we have quality and diverse data when we're training our algorithms and models, because they will have a very close and direct and almost like building impact on anything that happens to the model in the future. So we really need to make sure that the data that we collect is diverse. It represents a good group of, like a large group of people, and it stays away from any biases that it can. Um, then when it comes to designing our algorithms, we need to make sure that our algorithms are actually fitting to the thing that we're building. We need to make sure that they, again, are not introducing any new bias in the steps of building our systems. Make sure that they're transparent, or at least something that you can hold accountable. It's really important to be able to go back and sort of refine your model if it needs to be refined, or even go back to the first step and refine your data if it needs to be refined. So we need to be able to monitor our machine learning models or algorithm models as they progress. So, if at any stage in the process we think that the model has diverged from the initial intention, we need to be able to go in and sort of bring it back to what the intended purpose actually was. And data collection, you're right, VJ525, data collection is very expensive. And we can improve the data and its quality, or bolster the algorithm sufficiently. Absolutely. And I think both of those are expensive solutions, right? But I think if we are going to build these systems at all, I think it definitely needs to be done in a proper way. Like, you could take an easy route, but it would cause a lot of harm in the long term, right? You could say, oh, this is what's convenient for us to gather. Like, we can gather convenient data, or we can, only sample this group of people. And because it's too expensive for us to go and, get data from other sources. But, that's going to lead to a poor representation and a biased model, just long term. But also, like, if thinking from a company's perspective, like, if they were to build a model like this, it hurts their integrity. It also could cost them a lot of legal issues in the future. So I think though it might be expensive to gather some of this data, it's really important not only for the people who are involved, but hopefully also for the companies that are involved, right? So that they're thinking about the longevity of the things that they're building. Cool. Yeah, say we're trying to move away from sort of the energy, VJ525, I'll quote you, we'll fix it in post production, and that seems to be a very common thing in development. Um, but it's something that we really need to move away from because it can cause a lot of issues, not only for the people you're deploying these products to, but also it could come back and backfire on the company itself. And I think a lot of you know I think there's been an awareness, a raise of awareness over the years on these sorts of ethical guidelines. But sometimes, I mean, the truth is that sometimes it's hard to make the most ethical decisions, right? But it is also just as equally important that things are done in an ethical manner. Um, so hopefully we can, start to move away from the we'll fix it post production as much as we can. Um, I would like to say there is a hope for society. I'm reading from E000E. I'm reading a comment in the chat. If social media companies themselves find disinformation is good for the bottom line, is there hope for society? Yeah, and that's a really big thing, right? Because that goes back to human ethics, and that's why I think this topic is really interesting. Because not only are we talking about ethics when building technology, we're talking about like individual and moral ethics that people have, right? And it goes like through the entire hierarchy of everyone that's involved in the process of building a system, um, because we we hope that people are going to uphold ethical considerations on an individual level, um, and thus you'll have a collective of individuals who uphold an ethical guideline on an individual level, which then spreads to the company itself or the team, or the society overall. Um, so yeah, it definitely goes back to you know if each individual does their part, then we can have a society as a whole sort of naturally doing its part. And I'd like to hope that there is a hope for society there. um, um, yeah. Thank you for that question, by the way. Fairness is fairness is something that uh, is something that we, on an individual level, can look into and say, put yourself in the other person's position and say, and hopefully people can do this at a large scale, but say, is it fair? Would it be fair if I were in their position? And I think we really need to use like fairness metrics like that, to sort of, understand if it's okay, to build things the way that we are, or if we're instead taking sort of if we're taking advantage of people through their unawareness, um, or maybe stripping them of equal opportunities. Cool. So some ethical and legal considerations that we talked about, just having like data protection laws would be really helpful, so that we are not collecting data that is wrongful or has the wrong intent for the users that are having their data collected. And so that when we do sort of uh, so that when we do like collect the data that we collect, we are doing right with it, and rather than exploiting people for their data, we're protecting their data and using it in a positive way, because data is very powerful, but it can be used in the wrong ways. And I think that's a big fear that a lot of people have right now, and it seems to be a very sort of topic of conversation, um, and rightfully so. Cool. Um, Talking back about ethical and legal considerations again, when we talk about like laws, we did talk about laws that governments have, and sort of coming up with a standardization of the laws that are being uh, that these like governing bodies are using to regulate AI that's being created, and how it's being created. Yeah, BJ525 in chat says, I feel like these effects are a magnification of the red tapism and inequalities of society. Since AI is purely logical and mathematical, when it goes wrong, we get the purest proof of bias. Yeah, that is true. Um, I like that actually, because that's essentially what we're doing, right? And that's why it's also um, interesting because when we're building these systems, going back to AI, what we're trying to do with AI is we're building systems that almost mimic things that human intelligence does, right? Humans are going to have a natural sort of bias when they're, you know, doing things in the world, when they're making decisions, or, you know, say that there's a court hearing and a judge has to make a decision, there is going to be some sort of bias that the judge would have. And that's why you have a jury of people that sort of, you know, sort of acts as a balancing factor. And I think using sort of that method of understanding how we can limit biases, we can also try to do exactly that and sort of replicate it into a world of technology, and AI. We know that those types of biases, the various types of biases, are going to exist and they're almost inevitable, but we can try to mitigate them by using techniques that try to cut them out as much as we can from various steps in the process. And there are a lot of people that are going to be involved in the process. Um, and we need to make sure that those are that we're, you know, employing and including the right people, the right stakeholders within those processes. Yeah. um, yeah, so, you know, going back to like creating a standardization of these processes, we do need a multidisciplinary um, sort of understanding of how we can do that. We need to have people of various disciplines and, you know, backgrounds. So if you have a company that's developing, um, you know, an AI model, you need to make sure that sort of everyone in that chain is behaving in an ethical manner and has the right intentions for the system that they're creating. And that goes from, you know, the founders of this organization to the software developers and the engineers who are bound by these code of ethics. Um, and also, human precedence is a great way to sort of mitigate bias. So I talked a little bit about how you can have humans and these systems sort of go hand in hand, because it's almost like a fact checking, right? Like if something goes wrong within the model, a human would be able to check up and say, hey, like we need to change our model. It's, you know, diverting from the original use of this model. So, you know, in other cases, it is just necessary to provide human override in general. So if you were to, you know, be diagnosing um, a patient, say for example, if that patient, if a human believes that they have been incorrectly diagnosed, human override should take precedence, I think, in that sort of situation. But I think it is really necessary to sort of have humans go hand in hand with these systems that we're creating so that we can monitor them closely, right? It's almost like teaching a child, um, you know, the what's right and wrong. You're going to have your own biases, sure, but you're trying to hopefully mitigate those biases by introducing the child to, various different to different people, to different ideas, and sort of teaching them what is when they make a decision, like this was a good decision, or reinforcing that that was not a good decision. And just like we do with humans, how we help humans sort of build sort of a code of ethics or a moral sense of conduct in society, we can sort of apply those ideas also to AI and ML. Cool. So this I wanted to leave open just for us to sort of discuss anything that y'all have that you want to discuss in terms of bias, how it's introduced into AI ML, any case studies that you are interested in. Maybe you've read an article recently and you're like, did you know this company was doing this? Or I'd love to hear some things that you are interested in. Maybe we can talk. Yeah. I know you are probably typing, so I'll let y'all type for a moment. Yeah, I mean, we did talk about, sort of, we did talk about a few different broad sort of case studies within like healthcare and, financial services, criminal justice, and employment and things like that. So if you want to talk about more of those sort of along the lines of that. The IBM healthcare model. I don't know much about the IBM healthcare model. Would you like to tell us a little bit about it? Yeah. Hello, 2022. Yeah, I'd be interested in knowing more about the IBM healthcare model. That sounds interesting. VJ525, one interesting strategy proposed by multi-agent systems researchers is to induce a sense of self into the models. Yeah, that I find really interesting, right? Because it essentially goes back to what this sort of definition we kind of started off with of AI, is we're almost mimicking human intelligence in some ways, or intelligence in general in some ways. So just like we do with humans, this sense of self that we develop over a span of time is essentially what we're trying to teach a system to do, right? That's cool stuff. Do you want to look up the IBM healthcare model? I'm actually curious now. Here is their link. Hold on just a moment. This is IBM's page on their healthcare model. I don't know anything about this, so I'm gonna sort of read through it. I'm kind of interested. Yeah. Okay, wait, maybe I can share my screen. Share. Can y'all see that? Oh, well, let me add it to the stream. Can y'all see that? Nope, wrong thing. Not that. Give me a second. This is what I meant to share. Oh, well, this is what I meant to share. Okay, cool. So IBM has a unified data model for healthcare to improve population healthcare management programs. Okay. Well, it looks like they're trying to support data privacy. Let's read this. Putting data governance at the heart, shortening healthcare's path to AI. Okay. Oh, well, there's an hour-long video, which we will not be watching. But if you are interested, here's the link. Let's see if they have like details, or no, it's just the link. Okay. Here's a link for that if you want to go check it out. Let's see what their data models are about. Okay, medical inflation. It is acknowledged that the costs of healthcare are increasing at a faster pace than those of other services. I believe it. Together with factors such as growing populations and an increase in the age of demographic, this medical inflation puts further strain on health services whose funding cannot grow at a similar rate. This applies when health services are privately or publicly funded. Okay. The IBM Unified Data Model for Healthcare, UDMH, plays a significant role in addressing issues by supporting the tracking of patients' medical data, their participation in healthcare management programs, and the enrollment of patients with chronic conditions in appropriate registries. That's interesting. Yeah, what do y'all think about that? Because if we sort of going back to, I'm looking at this right here. Thank you for joining VJ525 and for the awesome discussions. Yeah, so, okay, we talked about data privacy. They're definitely tracking patients' medical data. And we hope that they're doing it in such a way that is ethical and does not violate the rights of the individuals. But those would be considerations that IBM would have to make when they're collecting this data. Their participation in healthcare management programs. Now, if they're using these data models to sort of understand where people are participating in various programs, and maybe they're using these models to sort of group people into various programs, they would want to make sure that they limit the types of biases that they're using in their data models. So if they're making any like vast generalizations of groups of people and the programs that they choose to engage in, then they would definitely need to sort of like look at their models. Ideally, you would want to make sure that if you do have a data model, that it represents the patients that you have that would be taking part in those programs, and you're not sort of stereotyping them into certain programs and then leaving them out of others. So making sure they have equal opportunities to those. And then enrollment, I like how enrollment is, I think, spelled incorrectly. It's missing an L. Um, the enrollment of patients with chronic conditions in the appropriate registries. Yeah, that's really interesting, because we'd want to hope that the data that they're using to sort of enroll these patients into appropriate registries, that data is not biased, and that the data or the model itself understands or has a good understanding of how to actually group people within those chronic conditions. And yeah, so lots of considerations for IBM there. That's cool. Thanks for bringing that up. I feel like I got to learn something about IBM and their healthcare model. I'd like to know more about it, so I will probably be reading up on this a little bit more. But I will share this link with you all in case you're interested in sort of reading through this document. I will not be reading through the entire document because it is 11 pages for the sake of time. And but yeah, it does go in, and it looks like it talks about patient information and how they're sort of collecting those records. Cool. It looks like they're looking at patients with within the diabetic population. It looks like they're giving us a little bit more information on what kind of data is captured, how they're structuring their data, which would be really interesting to look at, because you could sort of go in and see where they are or are not using ethical practices, or what their sort of what their practices are and stuff. It looks like they're using natural language processing, which is really cool. Awesome. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. I'm glad we got to look into that a little bit. So as we sort of, near the end of this, a quote that I really like: the most important ethical issues in AI are not created by AI itself, but by humans who design, build, use, and regulate these systems. Timnit Gebru, I've heard his name pronounced a couple of different ways, so I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly, but he is a AI researcher and an ethical advocate. You should go look him up. He does a lot of cool research with AI. Yeah, thank you all for joining this. I'll do like a brief recap of what we sort of talked about in our discussion today. It's really important for us to understand biases that we're introducing into AI and ML, because we are increasingly integrating these technologies into a lot of key aspects of our lives, of our day-to-day lives. And so if any process within those systems is biased, whether it be the data, the algorithms, the models, they can really be amplified, and they can perpetuate forward already like existing inequalities we might have, or discriminations that we have within our society, and it can create some really serious consequences, probably maybe even at a faster rate than humans alone. And in order for us to sort of avoid these consequences, we really do need to understand the sources of our bias in AI and ML, and the steps we can take to prevent it. And hopefully we can all be mindful and ethical as self, and also as we integrate into society and with those around us, when we're building things and bringing new technologies into the world, and that we carefully examine the types of new ideas and systems that we're bringing into the world. We want to make sure that we're promoting equality and being fair, and sort of limiting any existing biases or discriminations that might already be there. And it really does, like we talked about, and you all brought up some awesome points throughout this discussion. It takes a really deep understanding of the sort of existing complexities between multidisciplinary areas of understanding, when it comes to developing AI, whether that's like an interplay between the data, the algorithms, understanding humans, how we interact with each other in social environments, and how we interact in the world, understanding our legal systems, and sort of having this commitment to actually developing AI and ML in an ethical and responsible manner so that we are doing no harm and we are acting in the best interest of society at large. Thank you all for being a part of this discussion. I really appreciate all of y'all that came out and gave a lot of input. I had a great time. So hopefully you're keeping aligned with values and ethics as you go off into the world and build great things, whether that's at hackathons or whether that's in industry. And I hope you had a good time hanging out today. I certainly did. So thank you all. And I will be sending these slides out and the GitHub information in Discord, in the Global Hack Week Discord a little bit later. So cool. Any final remarks from anyone? Anything you'll want to say before we hop off? Thank you, KZE Fram, for saying that this has been enlightening. Thank you for coming out. Y'all are awesome. All right. Well, hopefully I will see you all very soon around the hackathon community. Thank you all. Take care. Bye-bye.